podium the President of the Women's Caucus, the Honorable Senator Catherine Pugh.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, and our Lieutenant Governor, we are so pleased to be with you this morning. As you well know, we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Women's Suffrage March of 1913. I always say a good idea becomes a great idea when people come together. You know, we started this idea working with Kathy Klausmeyer, our senator from Baltimore County, because only one of the great stops along the way is doing a great celebration this Saturday, and we want you all to be there as well. And then we had a conversation with our Speaker Pro Tem who said, let's do it here. And then the Women's Caucus invited the President and the Speaker to one of our meetings. And they said, why not have a joint celebration? And so not since 1997 has there been a joint celebration of women in these chambers. So for that, we are not only grateful, but we think you all made a very wise decision. And so we will now be led in prayer by our Speaker Pro Tem, Adrian Jones.
Dear God, we thank you for this gathering and the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the Women's Suffrage March of 1913. We ask you to remind us all gathered that the Women's Suffrage March was about equality in all areas of life for women. The right to vote, the right to work, the right to be educated, and the right to earn equal pay for the jobs that are the same as men. We are so proud of the women whose shoulders we all stand, not for their courage and tenacity, so many of us would not be sitting in the seats or holding the positions we hold today. Thank you to Edith Houghton Hooker, a leader in the women's suffrage movement in Maryland. We are empowered by women such as Delegate and Senator Mary Eliza Walters Rista from Harford County, who was the first woman elected to the House of Delegates in 1921 and became the first woman elected to the Maryland State Senate. God bless this joint session, which acknowledges the struggle by women to attain the most basic right of all people, the right to vote, as finally granted to us as women with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. It is our prayer that we leave here more determined and united in uplifting women throughout our state and country to achieve their hopes, their dreams, and their desires. These and all other blessings we ask in your name, amen and a women.
We learned a lesson in the Senate about the sunflower, taught to us by our president, but those of us who are buffs of history, and myself, who probably have spent more hours reading about women's history than most people would probably read in a lifetime, we learned that the sunflower was a symbol of the women's suffrage march when Kansas was trying to bring forth a referendum for women's suffrage. And because the flower opens and shines its light toward the sun, this is why it became a symbol of women's courage and women's suffrage. So,
I certainly want to bring greetings to the Women's Caucus on behalf of the Maryland House of Delegates, and thank each and every one of you for what you've contributed to the state of Maryland. It's a pleasure to participate in this great day, and I look forward to working with you not only in the past years, but into the future. Thank you very much.
Let me just say, when I came to the Senate of Maryland, first of all, I worked under and for Pauline Menace and Ann Hull and the Prince George's delegation. It was very exciting times. I was later followed by our treasurer, Nancy Cobb, working with Delegate Pauline Menace. But when I came to the Senate, I met three leaders. Peg Schweinhout, who is an expert on senior citizens, the Grand Dame from Montgomery County. Rosalie Abrams, who was a veteran of World War II. Her brothers all fought in World War II. She was a nurse in World War II. And the third was Senator Verda Welcome. Verda Welcome was a teacher and a civil rights leader. And I learned from those three people. And I'm happy to say that your numbers have tripled, quadrupled, but the quality of representation has continued to grow and grow. And as you've grown and made your numbers larger, you've made our state so much better by your presence. And I just want to say, on behalf of the Senate of Maryland, we have a resolution that we're going to present to the Women's Caucus and just say thank you for a job well done. Thank you.
Wow, what an honor and a privilege to be here with each and every one of you. I want to thank the Speaker and the President for convening this joint session, and certainly to distinguished guests and friends. It's a privilege to be able to honor a group of women who insisted that their voices be heard and who had the courage to fight for their rights and refused to accept that their destiny was not of their choosing. The women who marched for women's suffrage 100 years ago believed not just in equality, but also that change is possible only if you're willing to take action. And in Maryland, we have a proud tradition of women taking action, like those who did 100 years ago, women who stand up and say, we belong here, women like Senator Catherine Pugh and the 56 members of the Women's Caucus. And I want to thank each and every one of you. The women's suffrage has not only resulted in a woman's right to vote and to hold office, but also to be full participants in public and private life. Your march 100 years ago began, or at least accelerated, the march towards equality of opportunity for women in Maryland and across the nation. Today, young women, like my daughter Rebecca, wake up every morning to limitless opportunities to pursue their dreams, where she and young women around the state know that there's no goal that they can't pursue. So I just came by this morning to salute the women who had the courage to march 100 years ago, the women who have continued marching ever since, and the members of the Women's Caucus for creating a world where my daughter and all women have rights that are both protected and respected. Thank you very much.
A poem, Song for Equal Suffrage, Day of Hope and Day of Glory. After slavery and woe, comes the dawn of women's freedom, and the light shall grow and grow, until every man and woman equal liberty shall know, in freedom marching on.
Woman's right is woman's duty. For our share in life we call. Our will it is not weakened, and our power is not small. We are half of every nation. We are mothers of them all. In wisdom, marching on.
Not self, but larger service has our cry for freedom grown. There is crime, disease, and warfare in a world of men alone. In the name of love, we're rising now to serve and save our own as peace comes marching on.
By every sweet and tender tie around our heartstrings curled, in the cause of nobler mother is women's flag unfurled, till every child shall know the joy and peace of mother's world as love comes marching on.
We will help to make a pruning hook of every outgrown sword. We will help to knit the nations in continuing accord. In humanity made perfect is the glory of the Lord, as our world goes marching on.
And in this final presentation, we ask you all to listen carefully because through this presentation, we try to tell the story of the Women's Suffrage March through Maryland in 1913.
Whereas the first organized women's suffrage movement began in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, at the Women's Right Convention. It was here the suffragists, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, drafted a declaration of sentiments that included demanding the right to vote for women. The declaration was based on the Declaration of Independence.
Whereas the suffrage movement gained a great deal of strength after the passage of the 15th Amendment, which in 1870 gave black men the right to vote, but did not mention women.
Whereas in 1890, the National Women's Suffrage Association, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and the American Women's Suffrage Association, led by Lucy Stone, merged to be more effective in securing the right to vote for all women.
Whereas women's groups in New York and the states around the country organized marches and parades as forms of active protests in support of women's right to vote.
Whereas the suffrage hikes were the original idea of Rosalie Gardner Jones, who began by organizing a tour of Long Island, New York, in a little cart drawn by one horse and decorated with suffrage flags and banners.
Whereas Miss Jones recruited a small army of brave and devoted members, of which she was the general and Miss Ida Craft of Brooklyn the colonel.
Whereas the success and publicity from state marches around the country prompted Alice Paul, a 28-year-old Quaker from New Jersey, to organize the Women's March to Washington, D.C., to take place the day before the inauguration of President-elect Woodrow Wilson.
Whereas Alice Paul's first attempt at organizing the D.C. March failed, and so she convened a meeting on January 13, 1913, where she started raising funds for the march.
Whereas the total cost of the march to Washington, D.C., spearheaded by Paul's efforts, was $14,906.08, a princely sum in 1913 when the average annual wage was $621.
Whereas the marchers' pilgrimage began at 9 a.m. in the Hudson Terminal on February 12, 1913, on Lincoln's birthday, and would travel through New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland.
Whereas thousands of people were gathered at Newark, New Jersey, to see the start of the Army of the Hudson, which was now known as the Army of the Potomac, and hundreds marched with them.
Whereas the mayors of the places along the route would send delegations to meet the women and escort them to the town halls where the speech making would begin.
Whereas the marchers reached Philadelphia at 7 o'clock on a Sunday evening, where the streets had been packed for hours awaiting their arrival.
Whereas in Wilmington, Delaware, the City Council declared a half-holiday, the mayor and officials met the women's suffrage hikers at the edge of town and escorted them to the town hall.
Whereas the mayor of Wilmington also wrote a letter of introduction for the women marchers to the mayor of Baltimore.
Whereas on February 20th, 1913, the women marchers crossed the Maryland state line to begin an 18-mile trek to Elkton, Maryland.
Whereas upon entering Maryland, General Jones grasped some of its soil and said, "Maryland soil, we bless thee in the name of equal suffrage. May our journey be pleasant and our cause prosper within your borders."
Whereas the women's suffrage hikers were treated to luncheons and concerts while passing through small villages and towns such as Constantinople, Webster, and Churchville.
Whereas the brass band and citizens committee crossed the Susquehanna River and met the marchers at Perryville, then escorted them to the Havre de Grace City Hall, where Mayor Webster gave an address and presented them with the key to the city.
Whereas the roads and weather had been unfriendly ever since the marchers crossed the Mason-Dixon line. However, General Jones was quite pleased with the enthusiastic receptions from the people along the way.
Whereas the women were accompanied by the 1st Troop Owl Patrol of the Boy Scouts to Bel Air, Maryland. The hikers stretched out over 2 miles. The women suffered from injured feet and ankles.
Whereas Overly's Town Hall, now home to the Natural History Society of Maryland, previously Chelsea Place, was to be one of the main stopping points for the entire group before they marched on to Washington.
Bunch of well wishes came out by trolley car to meet the group. However, the younger women, led by the General Jones, Walker, Faster, were determined to push on to Washington, D.C.
Whereas on February 23, 1913, several women remained in Overly with Colonel Ida Craft to socialize and participate in a celebration for those who stuck to the original route and destination.
Whereas on February the 25th, the women marchers led by General Jones arrived a day early in Baltimore and were joined by women from Goucher College.
Whereas the stops in Baltimore included a stay at the Stafford Hotel, a visit with Cardinal Gibbons at his residence, and a luncheon sponsored by the Sons of Job, and a visit with acting Mayor Hubert.
Whereas the women's suffrage marchers continue from Baltimore to Laurel, Elkridge, and on to Hyattsville, where the women were met by former Mayor Magruder, who escorted them to a luncheon courtesy of the Prince George's County Businessmen's Association.
On February 28, 1914, mission accomplished. After 17 days of hiking over approximately 250 miles of mostly muddy roads and encountering everything from snowstorms to hostile hecklers, General Jones and her suffragist army of the Hudson strolled triumphantly into Washington, D.C.
Whereas they were greeted by crowds that had lined the streets of D.C. for several hours. At the headquarters of the Congressional Committee of the National American Suffrage Association across from the Treasury Building.
Whereas on Monday, March 3, 1913, clad in a white cape astride a white horse, lawyer Inez Milholland, at the age of 27, led the Great Women's Suffrage Parade down Pennsylvania Avenue.
Whereas behind Mulholland's struts a long line with 9 bands, 4 mounted brigades, 3 hurdles, and about 24 floats, and more than 5,000 marchers.
Whereas 14 women walked over 250 miles of the march from New York to Washington, D.C., averaging 19 and a half miles a day, gaining crowds of hundreds that joined them along the way.
Whereas women were jeered, tripped, grabbed, and shoved, and some heard the indecent epithets shouted mostly by men. Hundreds of women were injured, and no one was arrested for their offenses.
Whereas, despite the enormous difficulties, many of those in the parade were determined to deliver their message of equality at the voting booth and to request an audience with the president.
Whereas the pageantry began with the singing of the Star Spangled Banner and concluded with General Jones receiving flowers and disbanding her army.
And whereas Maryland suffrage movement was led by Edith Horton Hooker, who organized the Just Government League affiliated with the National American Women's Suffrage Association.
Whereas states throughout the nation joined others in giving women the right to vote. Maryland tried on 2 separate occasions, 1910 and 1916, and failed.
Whereas women in Maryland would not gain the right to vote until 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution.
Whereas today, we, the women of the Maryland General Assembly, 56 strong, and the first women's caucus in the nation, bipartisan,
Democrat and Republican, of all races, origin, sexual orientation, and religious conviction, stand here today before this joint assembly to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Women's Suffrage March and acknowledge the celebration that will take place this Saturday in Overley, one of the stops on the 250-mile hike, as mentioned in this proclamation.
Be it therefore resolved that on this 100th anniversary of the 1913 march of 5,000 women from New York City to our nation's capital to promote gender equality and access for women at the ballot box, the women legislators of Maryland take notice, feel pride, and commit ourselves to work for the acceleration of gender equality in all aspects of American life, which was, in fact, what the women's suffrage movement was all about. We invite our male colleagues of the Maryland General Assembly to continue moving forward with us, strategizing with us, voting with us, to help us to break all glass ceilings which impede the rights and opportunities of women and girls in this great state of Maryland and our nation. We thank you for this opportunity to share this commemoration with all of you. But I also wanted to acknowledge Margaret Brent. Margaret Brent had the courage, I believe that was in the year of 1648, before a group of men in the General Assembly, to ask for not one vote, just like a woman, but 2 votes. And while she did not get it, she is actually the first woman in the country to ever ask for the right to vote for women. Thank you all.